Pack your things and disappear from my husband's hotel. Marguerite Welds, 63-year-old mother of Carson Weld, upended Sloane's overnight bag directly onto the marble floor of the Stonehaven Grand Penthouse suite. A folded blouse, a leather notebook, and a small framed photograph scattered across the floor without a sound. Sloane Keller Weld, 37-year-old wife of Carson and daughter of the late Elias Holloway, stood near the suite's floor-to-ceiling windows and watched her belongings land. Rupert Weld, 66-year-old founder and executive chairman of Weld Hospitality Group, picked up the framed photograph from the floor. He examined it for a moment, then placed it face down on the credenza, as if even the image of Sloane needed to be removed. Carson Weld, 40-year-old vice president of development at Weld Hospitality and Sloane's husband of 6 years, stood near the door with his arms crossed. Beside him stood Simone Taft, 34-year-old vice president of brand strategy at Weld Hospitality and Carson's mistress, watching the scene with the patience of someone who had been told in advance how it would end. Sloane looked at her husband. "Are you going to say anything?" Carson kept his eyes on the floor. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." Hayward Cross, 61, Rupert's personal attorney, placed a folder on the suite's dining table. Inside was a divorce petition and a proposed settlement agreement. Carson picked up the pen. Simone rested her hand lightly on his shoulder, and while Sloane's photograph lay face down on the credenza and her belongings were scattered across a floor she secretly owned, her husband signed the papers. What Carson Weld did not know, what none of them knew, was that Sloane was the sole beneficiary of the Holloway Realty Trust, a private property holding entity created by her late father, Elias Holloway, one of the most influential commercial real estate developers in the country. He did not know that the Holloway Realty Trust owned the Stonehaven Grand outright, along with 4 other flagship properties that Weld Hospitality Group operated under long-term lease. He did not know that 18 months earlier, when Weld Hospitality had come within days of insolvency, Sloane had quietly authorized a $22 million emergency credit facility through the trust that saved every employee, every vendor contract, and every hotel in the portfolio. He certainly did not know that the building his mother called "my husband's hotel" had never legally belonged to the Weld family at all. Stay until the end, because the family that emptied Sloane's bag onto a penthouse floor is about to discover that the floor itself belongs to her. Subscribe now and comment truth if you believe real power never needs to announce itself. Sloane had not lied to Carson before their marriage. She had told him her father left her a private trust with real estate holdings. Carson had asked once and she had answered plainly. He had never asked again. He assumed the trust was modest because Sloane lived modestly. She drove an ordinary car, wore simple clothes, declined the kind of social performance that announces wealth. He mistook her discretion for smallness. Her father had raised her to understand the difference. Elias Holloway had built one of the most valuable commercial real estate portfolios in the country across a 40-year career. Office towers, hospitality buildings, retail properties, land parcels in cities where others hadn't thought to look yet. He was not famous. He did not appear in profiles. He preferred it that way. He had given Sloane her mother's surname from the beginning, a deliberate act of protection. Clara Keller had died when Sloane was 12, and Elias kept the name attached to his daughter so she could move through the world without the assumptions that came with the Holloway name. When Elias died, he transferred everything into the Holloway Realty Trust and named Sloane its only beneficiary. Real power doesn't need an audience, he had told her once, standing on the roof of a building they were developing together. Find out who people are when they think you have nothing. That's the most accurate thing you'll ever learn about a person. Sloane had remembered that when she met Carson, they met 5 years before their wedding at a hospitality industry conference in Atlanta. A keynote speaker had arrived late, and an elderly porter was left struggling alone in a corridor with an overloaded equipment cart, the wheel of which had locked. Half a dozen executives in tailored suits walked around him. Carson Weld had stopped. He took one end of the cart, talked the porter through releasing the wheel catch, and helped carry it to the correct room. He hadn't noticed Sloane watching from the far end of the hallway. He hadn't known she was anyone in particular. That was why it mattered. They were married the following year. Rupert Weld had insisted on a prenuptial agreement before the wedding. Sloane signed it without protest. It protected each spouse's inherited and separate property. Rupert believed he was shielding the Weld family's business from a woman whose background he considered unremarkable. He had unknowingly ensured that every property the Holloway Realty Trust held would remain entirely beyond his son's reach. 18 months before the penthouse confrontation, Weld Hospitality Group had nearly collapsed. The company had overextended into 3 simultaneous new developments. Supply chain delays, rising costs, and 2 underperforming hotel openings had drained the operating reserves. Payroll was at risk. Vendor contracts were approaching default. The lease payments to the Holloway Realty Trust were 90 days behind. Carson came home at midnight and sat on the kitchen floor. He told Sloane that 400 people might lose their jobs before spring. He told her he was terrified of watching his father's life's work disappear. She stayed with him until he exhausted himself into sleep. Then she went into her office and called Adele Foss, her attorney. By morning, Sloane had authorized the trust to extend Weld Hospitality's leases on modified terms and provide the $22 million emergency credit facility. The Weld family was told the facility came from an institutional real estate group with a long-term interest in the portfolio. Rupert was permitted to remain executive chairman through a protected transition period so the company could stabilize without alarming lenders or staff. Carson woke the next morning believing strangers had saved his family. He called it fortunate timing. Sloane said nothing. She had not expected gratitude, but she had expected that the man who knelt beside a porter in an Atlanta corridor was still somewhere inside the man she had married. She spent the months after the rescue watching for him. What she found instead was a pattern. It began with small exclusions. A company dinner where her place card was set at the far end of the table, past the spouses of junior executives. A photograph for Weld Hospitality's annual report where the marketing team positioned her away from the frame while Simone stood beside Carson. A charity event where Simone appeared at Carson's elbow before Sloane had crossed the lobby. None of these were proof. They were questions. The question that stopped being a question came 3 weeks before the penthouse confrontation. Weld Hospitality had hosted an industry event at the Stonehaven Grand's rooftop venue, a celebration of the company's recovery, the one Rupert took credit for in every speech and Carson accepted credit for in every meeting. Sloane attended as Carson's wife. She wore a dress she had bought for trust events attended by people wealthier than the Weld family had ever understood. It went unnoticed, the way most things about her went unnoticed in that room. During the reception, she saw Simone's wrist. A gold cuff bracelet, small and precise. Sloane recognized it because she had helped choose it. 6 months earlier, Carson had asked her to help him select an engraved bracelet for a senior female advisor who had helped finalize a difficult property negotiation. Sloane had found the piece and written down the inscription at Carson's direction. Something professional, something that would last. Now the bracelet was on Simone Taft's wrist. Sloane moved closer. The room was loud enough that no one noticed. She read the inscription on the bracelet's inner face. For everything after Stonehaven is ours, CW. She stood still for a moment. Then she set down her glass, walked to the elevator, and pressed the button for the ground floor. She needed air more than she needed to cry in a rooftop venue her trust paid for. That night, she called Adele and asked her to subpoena the Weld Hospitality corporate travel records. The records arrived 4 days before the private reconciliation weekend that Rupert's office had arranged at the Stonehaven Grand. They showed 13 trips on which Carson and Simone had shared accommodations. 11 were on the company account, recorded as business development travel. Sloane went to the reconciliation weekend because she needed one final thing, to hear Carson choose. Not because she believed he would choose her, because she needed to know whether any version of the man she had married was still capable of honesty. She had her answer before Marguerite opened the bag. She had it when she arrived and found her room assignment changed to a junior suite on a lower floor, while Simone had been booked into the suite adjacent to Carson's. She had it at the private family lunch, where Rupert talked about Carson's imminent promotion to CEO as if Sloane were not at the table. She had it when she pulled Carson aside, and instead of shame, she received a list of the ways their marriage had become inconvenient. "You've never really understood what this family requires," Carson said. "You've always been content to stay on the edge of it." She asked to leave. That was when Marguerite blocked the door. Birdie Crane, 58, the Stonehaven Grand senior housekeeper, had helped Sloane bring her bag to the suite when she arrived. She stepped forward from the doorway now. "I was present when Mrs. Weld checked in. There was nothing in her bag that belongs to this property." Rupert pointed at her without looking at her. "No one asked you." Hayward smoothed the settlement folder on the table. Both parties retain their separate and inherited property. The prenuptial terms are already in place. This is designed to be straightforward. Sloane looked at her husband. He was looking slightly past her. the way he had looked past her at dinners for the last 2 years. "I needed to know what you would choose," she said quietly, "while all of you believed I had nothing." Rupert laughed once. Marguerite folded her arms. Simone remained near the window. None of them understood what she meant. Sloane picked up her bag, retrieved her father's photograph from the credenza, and followed Birdie to the service corridor. Sutton Gray, 45, the Stonehaven Grand's general manager, met her at the elevator. Sutton had known Sloane's identity since the trust became the building's owner of record. "Preserve the sweet security footage from this evening," Sloane said. "All cameras, send a copy to Adele before midnight." Sutton nodded and went to do exactly that. Marisol Reyes, 31, Sloane's executive assistant, was waiting outside with a car. She had worked for Sloane for 4 years and was one of 3 people who fully understood what the Holloway Realty Trust controlled. She looked at Sloane's face and offered silence, which was what Sloane actually needed. Adele Foss, 48, was at the apartment when Sloane arrived. She listened without interrupting. When Sloane finished, Adele was already reaching for her phone. "I'm issuing evidence preservation notices to Weld Hospitality and the Stonehaven Grand tonight." "Wait," Sloane said. "There's an internal review already active. Let Fern finish first." Fern Alcott, 44, Weld Hospitality's chief operating officer, had been quietly compiling financial records for 6 weeks at Sloane's request. 3 days after the penthouse confrontation, her full report arrived. The findings were extensive. Carson had approved 13 private trips using company accounts, each recorded as business development travel. Simone had submitted the expense descriptions herself: hotel suites, car services, jewelry purchases, personal dinners, none of which corresponded to any active development in Weld Hospitality's portfolio. Rupert had used the trust's favorable lease terms as a selling point with lenders, implying he had negotiated them personally, without disclosing that the rates existed because the landlord was his son's wife. Hayward Cross had drafted a side letter attempting to reclassify the trust's emergency credit facility as a subordinated gift, which would have erased the trust's priority position in any future liquidity event. The letter had never been executed, but it had been drafted, reviewed, and sent for comment within his firm. Sloane read through the report in the quiet of the apartment. She had no view of the Stonehaven Grand from her windows, but she knew the building was there. Grant Pelham, 55, the lead independent director representing the trust's interests in the building's governance framework, convened the independent committee within 48 hours. Sloane stood at the end of the table and made her formal disclosure: her marriage to Carson Weld, the divorce petition, her identity as the Holloway Realty Trust's sole beneficiary, and the trust's ownership position across 5 of Weld Hospitality's flagship properties. Then she left the room and did not attend another session that touched Carson's employment. The investigation ran for 2.5 weeks. Rupert had no idea. He had been preparing Carson's CEO announcement for months. An industry gathering had been arranged at the Stonehaven Grand's main lobby. Reporters, photographers, select partners, a group of lenders who had agreed to attend. It was designed to present Carson as the natural successor of his father's empire. Rupert had told several attendees it was a formality. Their access cards stopped working at midnight, the night before the announcement. The Welds arrived at the Stonehaven Grand's main entrance at 9:15 the following morning. Rupert was on his phone. Marguerite was directing a driver on the handling of her luggage. Carson walked beside Simone, who had worn the white blazer she had chosen specifically for the photographs. Gilstrand, 38, the company's communications director, followed with a hired photographer. Rupert pressed his executive badge at the main door. The door held. He pressed it again. Red light. He turned to Terence Webb, 47, the Stonehaven Grand's senior security officer, a 20-year employee of the property. "There's something wrong with the system." Terence looked at his screen. "Your access was suspended last night, Mr. Weld." "That is not possible. The notification is logged here. I am the chairman of this company." "Your chairmanship was suspended pending the independent committee's findings," Terence said. "The building's owner authorized the access restriction." Carson pressed his badge red. Simone tried. Rupert moved toward the lobby doors and pushed them. They held. He turned back to Terence with his voice rising. "Open this building." "I don't have the authority to override the order." Terence remained behind the glass and did not raise his voice. He had been briefed. He knew the legal documentation existed. He stood behind it. Carson stepped away and called Hayward. "Don't create a scene," Hayward said immediately. "The notices are legally grounded. The committee has documented cause." On what basis? Expense falsification, undisclosed conflicts in the credit facility arrangement, the reclassification letter, a pause that lasted just a beat too long. I may need to withdraw from your family's representation. My firm's records are part of the document hold. Before Carson could respond, the hotel's interior doors opened from the inside. Sloane walked out. She was dressed the way she always dressed, dark jacket, plain shoes, nothing that announced itself. She carried a thin folder. Grant Pelham walked beside her. Fern followed with 2 independent directors and the trust's outside counsel. Rupert stared at her. "What is she doing here?" Marguerite said. Grant stepped forward. "Sloane Keller is the sole beneficiary of the Holloway Realty Trust. The trust owns this building and 4 other properties currently operated by Welds Hospitality Group under lease agreements. It also holds the primary credit facility extended to Welds Hospitality 18 months ago." The silence that followed was not the silence of a room waiting to hear more. It was the silence of something that had just stopped being arguable. Rupert turned to Carson. "You told me her father left her a small account." Carson was looking at Sloane. His face held the expression of a man finally understanding a conversation that had been happening around him for years without his participation. "I told you my father left me a trust," Sloane said. "You decided it was small." "You should have told me the truth," he said. "I told you the truth. You chose not to ask what it meant." He had no answer. There was nothing left in him that could challenge what she had just said, because he knew she was right. Rupert recovered quickly enough to become loud. "We have operating rights. We have contracts. You cannot remove us from our own company." Grant opened the folder. "Your operating leases are in default under the terms of the credit facility agreement. The committee found documented unauthorized use of facility funds for personal expenses and the drafting of a document designed to restructure the trust's legal position without disclosure. The findings are attached." The formal notices were distributed. Carson received a suspension pending the committee's final determination. Simone received notice that her employment had ended effective midnight, citing falsified expense records documented in the internal review. Rupert's chairmanship was suspended. Marguerite's access to corporate accounts and hospitality services was terminated. Simone looked at Carson. Whatever warmth had existed in her expression in the penthouse suite 3 weeks earlier was not present now. "You approved all of it," she said. "You submitted the descriptions," he said. The exchange, made in front of the reporters who had come expecting a different kind of announcement, closed the last chapter of what they had built together. The consequences that followed came from multiple directions and over many months. Rupert's chairmanship became permanent suspension after the committee completed its review. The operating leases were renegotiated under independent oversight with proper documentation. The credit facility's priority position was restored. The personal expenses became the basis of civil claims that took the better part of a year to settle. Glassmere had crumbled under the weight of its own debts, and the Stonehaven Grand continued under the trust's ownership, steadier than it had ever been under the arrangement Rupert called his legacy. Fern Alcott became Welds Hospitality's interim CEO. She understood the operations, knew every property manager by name, and had raised concerns about the financial irregularities before anyone in leadership had been willing to listen. Grant Pelham was formally elected as independent chairman. Expense controls were restructured. Corporate travel required independent pre-approval. A profit-sharing program was introduced so that the employees who had kept the properties running during the liquidity crisis could benefit when the company performed well. Sloane did not use her ownership to punish Carson for ending the marriage. She disclosed the conflict of interest, removed herself from every vote connected to his employment, and let the evidence determine the outcome. What happened to him happened because of choices he had made, not because of who she had been to him. His executive role ended with the committee's final determination. His name, submitted to competing companies, came back from background checks without offers. He sold the car the company had subsidized. He moved out of the apartment Welds Hospitality had provided. The equity he retained from the divorce settlement after the civil claims were deducted was considerably less than he had been expecting the morning he signed the petition. Simone Taft's claim that she had merely followed instructions collapsed when investigators produced emails she had written in her own words, arranging hotels, selecting gifts, approving charges. The career she had built from the company's resources disappeared when those resources were gone. She did not contact Carson after the formal notice was issued. There was nothing left in him worth contacting. Marguerite stood inside her own home months later, working through papers the civil settlement required, and understood for the first time that the buildings her family had pointed to with pride for more than a decade had never been theirs. The divorce was finalized under the same prenuptial terms Rupert had demanded before the wedding. The agreement he had considered a protection for his family had functioned precisely as written. Everything Sloane held through the trust remained hers. Both parties received what the agreement said they would receive, which turned out to be very different from what either of them had expected when they arrived at the penthouse that afternoon. A letter arrived at Adele's office 4 months after the hotel confrontation. Sloane recognized Carson's handwriting on the envelope before she opened it. He did not ask her to reconsider. He did not mention the trust or the buildings or the settlement terms. He wrote about the porter with the equipment cart in Atlanta. He wrote that he had gone back to that memory trying to understand where the person he had been that afternoon had gone, and that the most honest answer he could find was that he had let other people tell him who he was supposed to become until he no longer recognized the difference between their version of him and his own. He wrote that the apology arrived too late to change anything, and that he was writing it anyway, because it was the first honest thing he had done in a long time. Sloane read it twice. She put it in the same drawer where she kept the photograph of herself and her father. Several weeks later, she stood on the roof of the Stonehaven Grand in the early morning. The city spread beneath her. She could see 3 other blocks from up there, 2 of which held properties the trust owned. The same roof where she and her father had stood years earlier, reviewing renovation plans. The same view, different reasons for standing in it. She carried the small framed photograph. The corner of the frame was still scratched from the credenza. She had not replaced it. She did not feel triumphant. She did not feel the way revenge is supposed to feel. She felt the particular quiet of someone who had spent years carrying something heavy and had finally set it down. Below her, the Stonehaven Grand was already moving through its morning. Guests checking in, staff crossing the lobby, a kitchen somewhere 3 floors down beginning its prep work, hundreds of people doing the work that kept the building alive and functioning and real. None of them knew she was standing above them. Most of them would never know her name. Her father had told her that real power didn't need an audience. For years, she had taken that as wisdom about wealth, about how to manage what she owned without displaying it. She understood now that it was also wisdom about love, about the kind of love that stays quietly present without requiring recognition, without asking to be seen, that absorbs difficulty rather than announcing it, and about what it costs to give that kind of love to people who look at your silence and decide without asking that it means you have nothing to offer. She had deserved to be known, not because of the buildings beneath her feet, or the name on the trust documents, or the accounts that had saved a company while its executives took credit for surviving. Simply because she was there, simply because she was. The morning light moved across the city. She stood with her father's photograph, and the scratched frame, and the view he had spent his life building toward, and for the first time in a very long while, she felt entirely like herself.